not much that is romantic about this story. In the end, it is all about science bureaucracies, following the same dubious, self-serving decision-making pathways of other powerful bureaucracies operating within the ruling classes throughout human history. We presented overwhelming evidence, mountains of data, and simple mathematics that exposes the self-serving nature of bureaucratic processes, which are disguised as scientific processes in origin of life research. In part one, we also discussed the top of the structure of almost every powerful ruling bureaucratic hierarchy in history. At the top, people in possession of enormous political power, wealth, and social status are the ones that set the policies. These tend to be people who have developed channels that provide access to funding. Unfortunately, political power, wealth, and social status are the ultimate decision-making lubricants for bureaucrats. This has been true throughout human history, and the behavioral patterns of various rulers are essential to explaining this story simply because they illustrate what people with power are capable of doing to protect that power, wealth, and social status. The Wall Street Journal published an incredibly revealing article on September 24, 2023. The article provided details of efforts by 4 scientists conducting independent investigations into scientific papers published by high-profile researchers. The researchers in charge of the publishing of fraudulent papers are employed by both Stanford University and Harvard University, 2 of the wealthiest and most prestigious academic institutions in the world. These 4 investigating scientists are part of a fledgling reform movement attempting to help classroom teachers in the science community understand the dangers of continuing to blindly rely on published research as being factual. The eruption of these scandals are disturbing given the amount of credibility the peer review process has lost. The governing of the publishing of scientific papers has been stained. And as we will see as we look more closely at the evidence, it was not easy for these investigators to go public with their findings. Some observers believe these 4 independent investigating scientists have actually put their careers and their personal finances on the line to expose both faulty and fraudulent data that is regularly appearing in published research papers around the world. The fraud uncovered by independent investigator Elizabeth Bick is, putting it rather mildly, deeply troubling. Bick's investigation, which she conducted on her own, led to the resignation of Stanford University Chancellor Marc Tessier-Lavigne in 2023. Tessier-Lavigne resigned in disgrace due to his role as the lead scientist in the publishing of fraudulent scientific research. Amazingly, while Marc Tessier-Lavigne's papers were retracted by Stanford, and he was compelled to resign as the chancellor of Stanford over this research fraud scandal, he remains on the faculty at Stanford, and equally amazing, he continues to remain on the board of Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, a very large public drug company. Stanford has the 3rd largest endowment of any university in the United States. The school's endowment has over $36 billion in assets. The annual operating budget at Stanford is almost $9 billion per year. And yet the person who rose to the top of the leadership pyramid at Stanford, who was granted full policy-making authority over these resources at this highly acclaimed institution, was responsible for the publishing of research papers that a freshman recognized to be fraudulent. We'll get to that story in a minute. Think about the total absence of scientific vetting processes performed by the governing bureaucrats at Stanford. Some casual observers might ask, how could anyone come to understand that the data sets used in published papers were bogus with merely a glance? Yet it was an 18-year-old who was able to detect the obvious signs of fraudulent photoshopping in the data sets in Tessier-Lavigne's published papers. The three operators of the website Data Colada each hold PhDs. They conducted an investigation of Professor Francesca Gino, who is one of the highest paid tenure professors at Harvard. Their investigation led to a shocking expose of her publishing of papers that included what has been described by those familiar with the investigation's findings as blatantly fraudulent data. Gino's papers have since been retracted by Harvard. She was removed from the classroom and put on administrative leave. The irony of the Data Colada investigation was that Gino suggested in her paper, using what has been described as nakedly fraudulent data, she suggested that those who cheat do so simply because they are more creative than their counterparts who don't cheat. Turning back to the Stanford scandal, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals' board of directors has yet to ask for the resignation of disgraced former Stanford University Chancellor Marc Tessier-Lavigne from its board. Tessier-Lavigne's position on that board comes with an astonishing $700,000 a year salary. So the corporate bureaucracy at Regeneron has yet to take any action on this scandal, despite Tessier-Lavigne having resigned his chancellor position due to discredited scientific credentials. This behavior by Regeneron Pharmaceuticals Board offers viewers a glimpse of how dubious behaviors by some corporate bureaucracies often mirror, if not exceed, the corruption of powerful academic publishing bureaucracies. In the Gino case at Harvard, the investigators at Data Colada merely glanced at the data sets and easily noticed the likelihood of grossly biased false positives she had used. The data points were so far outside the normal boundaries of basic statistics, they immediately suggested overt fraud. And after an exhaustive investigation, the PhDs at Data Colada uncovered what has been described by those involved as amateurish data manipulations in the spreadsheets used. There is so much more evidence of a broken system, we don't have enough time to cover it all in this segment, but suffice to say, these processes are neither unusual nor accidental. Let's turn our attention to Great Britain and Dr. John Carlisle, who's an anesthesiologist in England. Dr. Carlisle is also an editor at the British journal Anesthesia. Dr. Carlisle has been exposing the existence of bad data used in medical studies for nearly 2 decades. He had this to say regarding the bureaucracies that allow researchers to get away with publishing fraudulent academic papers in the name of science. Quote, I don't see how they can turn around and say, well, it's not our job to actually check the data. Carlisle routinely audits patient data, underlying clinical trial studies, looking for signs it was falsified. He has found that 1 in every 3 papers has enough false data claims to make him not believe the results. The sheer volume of the fraud he encounters led to this statement, quote, if I was paid per hour, I'd be a very rich man. Why are the publishing houses earning millions of dollars? Why are people paying the journals unless the journals are doing the job? Carlisle thinks it should be the obligation of academic journals, not unpaid reviewers, to ensure the integrity of published papers purporting to advance the cause of science. Now, the published papers by Gino at Harvard and Tessier-Lavigne at Stanford that have since been retracted by both schools were all rubber-stamped by academic bureaucrats with zero vetting or accountability. The problems the 4 researchers identified in the Wall Street Journal article that were reported were uncovered merely by employing simple logic. There are many more incidents of outright fraud produced within the publish or perish model. These 5 independent academic investigators, Carlisle, Simonson, Nelson, and Bick, seem to have uncovered the tip of an iceberg. In doing so, they provide more compelling and corroborating evidence in support of everything we have described regarding the corrupt structure of incentives that are part of the publish or perish game maintained by academic bureaucracies ruling science. Even with these scandals in mind, there have been astonishing levels of progress achieved in virtually every area of science over the last 70 years, with the remarkable exception of origin of life research. One must understand why the stakes are so high in origin of life research to understand why sky-high barriers remain in place that hamper progress on the answer to the great question. The stakes are very high simply because the policy-making bureaucrats made the decision decades ago to dig in after the evidence went the wrong way in terms of their commitment to Darwin when Watson and Crick defined the properties of DNA. 70 years ago, when those discoveries were made, what should have happened is the policymakers running scientific bureaucracies should have simply admitted that the findings of Watson and Crick on the elaborate coding found in DNA was irreducible. Therefore, they should have simply honestly conceded that this was a game changer because it mathematically made it impossible to assume elaborate digital programming code embedded in DNA evolved due to some sort of self-organizing process. Sadly, this fundamental admission of basic truth never came about, simply because bureaucrats had long since deified Darwin's fatally flawed hypothesis on origin of life. Again, it is important to make the distinction here. We are not speaking of Darwin's natural selection theory. We're speaking about the origin of life. Natural selection explained how the beaks of finches on the Galapagos Islands adapted over time. It did not explain where finches came from originally. Regrettably, the ruling science bureaucracies dug in like Pope Urban VIII and his army of church bureaucrats and what they did when Galileo made the assertion that the earth orbited the sun. Denial once again became the modus operandi on bogus origin of life claims. And this denial includes continuing to ignore the long-standing observations by both Newton and Einstein that there is some spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. This is happening in the face of 70 years of failures in the labs. So, we see that thanks to self-serving stubbornness, accountability is particularly lacking in the origin of life segment of science, simply because the policymakers must save face at all costs, even if it means ignoring the mathematical realities of the information paradox. This sort of intransigence essentially guarantees future failure in the labs, and it practically mandates the publication of fraudulent papers. Now, the reform process to correct the corruption in the publishing process appears to be just barely underway. The inherently corrupt publisher-perish model that is producing rampant fraud by academic bureaucracies will remain for the time being. We are unlikely to see universities like Stanford or Harvard change policies that might result in their own embarrassment. But quietly, despite a general lack of anything more than a passing media interest in these astonishing scandals, the reform process has been accelerating over the last 20 years. According to Retraction Watch, which monitors the number of published papers that are withdrawn from being published, more than 5,500 faulty academic papers were retracted in 2022 alone. Now, this is up 4,600% from just 20 years ago. So there is more of a push to police the ongoing corruption that has been created by the perverse publish or perish incentive structures in academia. But the data suggests at this early stage in the process, there is no doubt the very top of the ruling science bureaucracy pyramid is still relatively unscathed and undeterred. It is just a matter of time before there will be a reform movement that applies more accountability specifically to origin of life research. To its credit, Harvard University conducted its own subsequent investigation of Francesca Gino's scandal and agreed with the independent unpaid investigators' findings. This was a good sign that some of the decision makers at Harvard University actually admitted that the peer reviews missed all the telltale signs of fraud. So this is a small step in the right direction. Harvard did order the retraction of Gino's papers, removed her from the classroom, and moved to revoke her tenure. These are actions that Stanford has been unwilling to undertake with Tessier-Lavigne. But there is some legal pushback. Gino hired lawyers, and they have filed a lawsuit against Nelson, Simmons, Simonson, well, and yes, Harvard University. There is big money at stake simply because these massively powerful bureaucracies have become very wealthy. All one needs to do is take a quick look at the size of the endowments and annual budgets at these powerful institutions. These schools have billions of dollars to spend each year. These are very deep pockets for trial lawyers to go after. Francesca Gino's lawyers have sued both the independent investigators and Harvard, claiming $25 million in damages. A young behavioral scientist named Pete Judo has posted a series of detailed videos about the legal implications of these scandals on YouTube. In one of his videos, Judo dissected Gino's lawsuit claims and her lawyers' filings. He found them to be groundless defenses. Judo described the filings as almost as juvenile as in their premises as the data manipulations that were in Gino's published papers. And perhaps more important to the overall picture, which is what we are getting at with this series on answering the great question. Other scientists have put together a GoFundMe page for the independent investigators at Data Colada. The GoFundMe page had raised over $300,000 to fight what appears to be face-saving litigation against the reformers by Gino. Also, it appears that most of the donations on the GoFundMe site have come from fellow science teachers. So perhaps the resistance is beginning to work a little more effectively behind the scenes. As we highlighted in part 1, throughout human history, we have seen conduct like this. There is simply nothing new about self-serving behaviors by powerful bureaucracies. It was easy to find the very same corrupt patterns of behavior in the conduct of theological bureaucracies in possession of political power, wealth, and social status as recently as several hundred years ago. And now, with not much more than a glance and a little digging, we are seeing the same exact behaviors engaged in by the science bureaucracies in the 21st century. Ultimately, it will be up to the 1.25 million teachers in the United States alone to say, enough is enough. Bans on discussion of the mathematics is done quite cleverly. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the use of the term evolution has been bandied about very broadly without proper scientific context. The clear distinction between the fundamental truth of natural selection regarding the adaptations of existing species has been blurred intentionally for decades. And since natural selection is very good science, it can, as a matter of routine, be mixed with bad science. This is a clever rhetorical process that falsely infers that natural selection can be properly applied to the mysteries associated with how the elaborate information encoded in the double helix of DNA originated. Natural selection and origin of life are two entirely separate and distinct different concepts that are being rhetorically placed under an all or none belief umbrella. And this clever manipulation, the term evolution, has been often reduced to being a philosophical battering ram. The term evolution should not be considered a synonym for natural selection. Natural selection is not a blanket explanation that includes the explaining of the great mysteries regarding the origin of life. The term evolution itself has been manipulated by bureaucracies to become a misconstrued concept. Still, this strategy has been successfully deployed by those who feel they are competing with theologians for educational funding. The exaggerations in the rhetoric implies that all theologians do not recognize natural selection as good science, when this is mostly not true. Most 21st century theologians recognize that natural selection is valid. However, the idea that mindless molecules self-organize is not valid. And as we have demonstrated, this misnomer, which is contradicted by basic mathematics, is being used effectively, just as the Inquisition was hundreds of years ago. For decades, the threat of being a natural selection heretic has kept biology teachers on a path of instruction that requires the presentation of false assertions in published papers while completely ignoring the information paradox. False claims about the origin of life are to this day still effectively using the term evolution ubiquitously as an intellectual shield to hide the critical relevance of the information paradox. If someone underneath the peak of the scientific hierarchy dares to cite the information paradox as a legitimate question, even their colleagues will face enormous peer pressures to characterize the dissenting colleague as an extremist and a non-scientific heretic. History teaches us that nobody rushed to Galileo's defense, despite many knowing he was right about planetary motion. The risks of defending Galileo were simply too great. So there are practical facts and forces at work here. The scientific bureaucracies have a proverbial termination guillotine. It remains a risk of professional suicide for science educators to ignore these forces aligned against discussion of mathematical facts associated with DNA. Still, Mahatma Gandhi led a reform movement that brought independence to India. During Gandhi's life in India, it was a country of hundreds of millions of people that was dominated by a few thousand British bureaucrats. While Gandhi was truly a great man whose just cause eventually prevailed, it is also important to remember that thanks to the British Empire's powerful ruling bureaucracy, Gandhi spent most of his adult life in jail for speaking his mind. Those who held more political power, wealth, and social status than Gandhi knew how to control a threat to their many perks that came with their power and authority. Sometimes those at the tip of the top of the ruling bureaucratic pyramid structures might not have the numbers, but so long as there is cooperation from those underneath their power structure, freedom to demand evidence can remain nothing but a mirage.